Thomas counted 8 dying foals as they staggered into his barn, their ice-covered bodies seconds from death. By sunrise, his massive mare had done something that would expose the man who tried to kill them. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The winter storm descended upon Thomas McCarthy's farm with a fury that seemed almost personal. He had lived in the Montana countryside for 63 years, weathering countless blizzards and harsh seasons, but something about this particular night felt different. The wind howled through the valley with an intensity that made the old barn timbers groan and creak, while snow fell so thick it was impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. Thomas stood at his kitchen window, nursing a cup of coffee that had long gone cold, watching the white curtain of snow obliterate everything beyond the glass. His weathered hands, marked by decades of hard farm work, gripped the mug tightly as concern creased his brow. In the barn, just 50 yards from the house, but barely visible through the storm, resided his pride and joy. Duchess was no ordinary horse. Standing at 18 hands high, the massive Shire mare was a gentle giant whose cream-colored coat seemed to glow even in the dimmest light. Thomas had raised her from a foal, and over the years she had become more than just a farm animal. She was his companion, his confidant in the quiet loneliness that had settled over the farm since his wife Martha had passed 3 years ago. Every morning, he would greet Duchess with an apple and a gentle pat on her enormous neck, and every evening he would tell her about his day as he brushed her flowing mane. The bond between them was something special, something that went beyond the typical relationship between a farmer and his livestock. As midnight approached, Thomas knew he needed to check on Duchess one more time before bed. The temperature had dropped to well below zero, and though the barn was sturdy and insulated, he wanted to ensure she had enough hay and that her water hadn't frozen solid. Pulling on his heavy coat, worn boots, and thick gloves, he grabbed a flashlight and stepped out into the storm. The cold hit him like a physical blow, stealing his breath and making his eyes water instantly. Each step through the knee-deep snow was a struggle, and the 50-yard journey felt like a mile. The wind threatened to knock him off his feet, and the snow stung his face like thousands of tiny needles. But Thomas pressed on, guided by the dim outline of the barn that appeared and disappeared in the swirling whiteness. When he finally reached the barn door, his hands were so numb he could barely work the latch. He wrestled it open, stepped inside, and quickly pulled it shut behind him, grateful for the relative warmth and stillness within. The familiar smells of hay, leather, and horse greeted him like old friends. Duchess stood in her spacious stall at the far end of the barn, her massive head turning toward him at his entrance. She nickered softly in greeting, her dark eyes reflecting the beam of his flashlight. "Everything okay, girl?" Thomas said softly, approaching her stall. "Just wanted to make sure you were warm enough out here." He checked her water bucket, pleased to find it still liquid, and added an extra armful of hay to her feeder. As he stood there, running his hand along Duchess's powerful shoulder and feeling the warmth radiating from her body, Thomas heard something that made him freeze. It was faint, almost lost beneath the howling wind outside, but unmistakable. A high-pitched whinny, desperate and weak, coming from somewhere beyond the barn walls. He cocked his head, listening intently. There it was again, and this time it was joined by others. Multiple voices, young and frightened, crying out in the night. Thomas's heart began to race. There were horses out there, and from the sound of it, they were in serious trouble. Without hesitation, Thomas grabbed a lantern from the wall and rushed back to the barn door. He threw it open and held the lantern high, peering out into the darkness. At first he saw nothing but snow and shadow. Then, as his eyes adjusted, he spotted movement at the edge of the light. Small shapes, pale against the white snow, were stumbling toward the barn. As they drew closer, Thomas gasped in disbelief. They were foals, 8 of them, no more than a few months old, their coats thick with ice and their small bodies trembling violently. They moved in a tight cluster, supporting each other, their spindly legs barely able to carry them through the deep snow. Come on," Thomas called out, waving the lantern to guide them. His voice was urgent but gentle, not wanting to frighten them further. The foals pushed forward with what little strength they had left, drawn by the light and the promise of shelter. As they reached the barn door, Thomas stepped aside to let them pass, counting them as they stumbled inside. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 8 foals, all of them white or cream-colored, all of them on the verge of collapse from cold and exhaustion. Where had they come from? There were no other horse farms within miles, and certainly no one would let their foals wander in weather like this. Thomas quickly shut the door behind the last foal and turned to assess the situation. The young horses huddled together in the center of the barn, shaking uncontrollably, their eyes wide with fear and exhaustion. Steam rose from their small bodies, and he could see ice crystals clinging to their manes and tails. They would die if he didn't act fast. He grabbed every blanket he could find, old horse blankets, tarps, anything that might provide warmth, and began wrapping the foals as best he could. They were too weak to resist, simply standing there as he worked, their heads hanging low. Then something extraordinary happened. Duchess, who had been watching the commotion with interest from her stall, began to move. The giant mare pawed at her stall door with one enormous hoof, the sound echoing through the barn like a drum. Thomas looked up from wrapping the foals, surprised by the urgency in her movements. Duchess nickered loudly, insistently, her eyes fixed on the shivering young horses. She pawed again, harder this time, and Thomas understood she wanted out. She wanted to reach the foals. For a moment he hesitated. Duchess was massive, and these were tiny, fragile creatures already on the edge of survival. What if she accidentally stepped on one? What if her size frightened them even more? But something in her eyes, a deep intelligence and purpose he had seen there countless times before, told him to trust her. Thomas crossed the barn and unlatched Duchess's stall door. The mare pushed it open immediately and stepped out with surprising delicacy for a horse of her size. She moved slowly, deliberately, each massive hoof placed with care as she approached the cluster of foals. The young horses looked up at her, and Thomas held his breath, expecting them to scatter in fear. Instead, something remarkable happened. The foals began moving toward Duchess, drawn to her as if by instinct. Their trembling legs carried them to the giant mare, and one by one, they pressed themselves against her enormous body. Seeking the warmth and security she offered, Duchess stood perfectly still, allowing the foals to position themselves around her. She lowered her great head and began gently nuzzling each one, her warm breath washing over their ice-encrusted coats. Thomas watched in amazement as the tension slowly drained from the foals' bodies. They stopped shaking quite so violently, their breathing became less labored, and the wild panic in their eyes began to fade. Duchess made soft, rumbling sounds deep in her chest, sounds Thomas had never heard her make before. They were soothing, maternal sounds, and the foals responded to them with small, answering whinnies. It was clear that Duchess had decided these foals were now under her protection. Thomas felt a lump form in his throat as he watched the scene unfold. In all his years working with horses, he had never witnessed anything quite like this. The mare positioned herself in the center of the barn, in the warmest spot away from any drafts, and seemed to be actively arranging the foals around her body. She would nudge one into a better position with her nose, encourage another to move closer with a gentle push from her shoulder. It was as if she knew exactly what they needed and was determined to provide it. Thomas quickly realized that Duchess's instincts were far better than his own fumbling attempts with blankets. He retrieved the extra hay and spread it in a thick bed around where Duchess stood, creating a soft, insulated nest. Then he brought bucket after bucket of lukewarm water, placing them within easy reach. The foals needed to drink, needed to replenish what the cold had stolen from their small bodies. Duchess seemed to understand this too. She would dip her own muzzle into the water, then lift it and look at the foals, as if showing them what to do. Slowly, cautiously, the young horses began to drink, taking small sips at first, then longer draughts as their thirst overcame their exhaustion. As the hours passed, Thomas settled onto a hay bale to keep watch. There was no way he was leaving the barn tonight, not with 8 mysterious foals fighting for their lives and Duchess playing guardian angel. He pulled his coat tighter and let his mind wander to the pressing question that had been nagging at him since the moment the foals appeared. Where had they come from? This was wild country, true, but there were no wild horse herds in this part of Montana. These foals were clearly domesticated breeds, their builds and features speaking of careful breeding. Someone owned them. Someone was missing them. But who would let 8 valuable foals wander out into a blizzard? The storm continued to rage outside, the wind screaming around the barn's corners and rattling the old structure. Inside, however, a pocket of warmth and safety had been created. Duchess stood like a living fortress, her massive body blocking the drafts and radiating heat. The foals had arranged themselves in a tight circle around her legs, some leaning against her barrel, others tucked between her enormous hooves. They had finally stopped shivering, and a few had even begun to doze, their small heads drooping with exhaustion. Thomas marveled at how Duchess adjusted her position constantly, never moving so much that she might disturb the foals, but always shifting slightly to ensure maximum warmth distribution. Around 3 in the morning, one of the foals, slightly larger than the others and with a distinctive patch of darker cream on its forehead, managed to stand on shaky legs and approach Duchess's head. The mare lowered her nose to the foal's level, and they touched muzzles in a gesture so tender it brought tears to Thomas's eyes. The foal then did something that shocked him. It attempted to nurse from Duchess, searching along her side with its small muzzle looking for milk. Of course, Duchess wasn't lactating. She hadn't had a foal of her own in years, but she stood patiently, allowing the youngster to search, seeming to understand the comfort the attempt brought, even if no milk was forthcoming. This told Thomas something important. These foals were still young enough to be nursing, which meant they had been separated from their mothers recently. The thought made his blood boil. What kind of person would separate foals this young from their mothers and then allow them to escape into a blizzard? It spoke of either criminal negligence or something more sinister. As the first gray light of dawn began to filter through the barn's high windows, Thomas stirred from an uncomfortable doze on the hay bale. His back ached and his neck was stiff, but the sight that greeted him made every discomfort worthwhile. All 8 foals were still alive, still pressed against Duchess, who stood exactly where she had positioned herself hours ago. The mare's eyes were half closed, but Thomas could tell she hadn't truly slept. She had kept vigil all night, a patient and protective guardian watching over her unexpected charges. The foals looked better. The ice had melted from their coats. Their breathing was steady and deep, and the desperate, haunted look had faded from their eyes. 3 of them were sleeping soundly, while the others dozed in that half-awake state horses often adopt. Thomas stood slowly, his joints protesting, and stretched. He needed to feed Duchess properly and figure out what to do about these foals. The storm had finally begun to die down, the wind no longer shrieking but merely whistling, and the snow had lightened to occasional flurries. He could see pale sunlight trying to break through the clouds. It was time to make some calls, to report what had happened, and see if anyone in the county was missing 8 valuable foals. But first, his animals needed care. He brought fresh hay to Duchess, who ate gratefully without moving from her spot, carefully selecting mouthfuls that wouldn't disturb the foals. He refreshed the water buckets and checked each foal carefully, running his experienced hands over their small bodies, looking for injuries or signs of frostbite. Miraculously, they all seemed relatively unharmed. Their youth and the thick winter coats they had already grown had protected them from the worst of the cold, and finding shelter when they did had saved their lives. Thomas found himself wondering again about their journey. How far had they traveled? How long had they been out in the storm? And most pressingly, how had they known to come to his barn? There were other structures along the valley, abandoned sheds and old equipment shelters, but these foals had made a straight path to his property. It was as if something had guided them here, to this specific place, to Duchess. As he worked, Thomas studied the foals more carefully. They were clearly well-bred animals. Their conformation spoke of quality bloodlines. They were all light-colored, ranging from pure white to cream to pale gray. And they all shared similar features that suggested they might be related, possibly all from the same breeding program. Their hooves, though caked with mud and ice, were well trimmed, indicating they had received proper care at some point. These weren't neglected animals who had escaped from poor conditions. These were valuable horses who had somehow found themselves in a desperate situation. The mystery deepened with each observation. By 7 in the morning, with the sun finally breaking through the clouds and casting long shadows across the snow-covered valley, Thomas made his way back to the house to use the phone. His fingers, still cold despite his gloves, fumbled with the dial as he called Sheriff Morrison, the county's long-serving lawman who knew everyone and everything that happened in their rural community. The phone rang 4 times before a gruff voice answered. "Morrison here." "Sheriff, it's Thomas McCarthy out on the old Miller Road property," Thomas began, his voice rough from the cold night and lack of sleep. "I've got a situation out here you need to know about. I found 8 foals in the blizzard last night, nearly frozen to death. They're in my barn now, safe, but I have no idea where they came from." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Thomas could almost hear the sheriff's mind working, sorting through possibilities. 8 foals, you say? What do they look like?" "All light-colored," Thomas replied. "White, cream, maybe some pale gray. Young, still nursing age if I'm judging right. Good quality animals, well cared for. Someone's missing them, Sheriff, and I'd like to know who and why they were out in that storm." The sheriff's tone became serious. "Don't let anyone take those foals until I get there, Thomas. I'm going to make some calls." There was something in Morrison's voice that made Thomas's stomach tighten. The sheriff knew something or suspected something that he wasn't saying yet. After hanging up, Thomas returned to the barn. The scene inside had changed slightly. The foals were now more alert, and several had risen to stand on wobbly legs, exploring their surroundings with cautious curiosity. Duchess watched them with what could only be described as maternal pride, her ears swiveling to track their movements. One adventurous foal, the one with the darker patch on its forehead that Thomas had mentally nicknamed Patch, had wandered over to investigate the barn's corners. Another, smaller than the rest with a pure white coat, stayed close to Duchess's front legs, apparently having claimed that spot as its own. Thomas smiled despite his concerns. There was something heartwarming about watching these young lives, so recently in peril, now beginning to show their natural curiosity and spirit. Thomas knew the foals needed proper nutrition, and soon. They were young enough that they should still be getting milk from their mothers, and while they could nibble on hay and drink water, that wouldn't sustain them for long. He had some emergency foal formula in his supply room, left over from years ago when he had briefly considered breeding Duchess. He had never used it, but he hoped it was still good. Retrieving the container, he checked the expiration date and was relieved to find it was still within acceptable limits. Following the instructions on the label, he mixed up a batch with warm water, creating 8 bottles that he carried back to the barn in a wooden crate. The foals eyed the bottles with suspicion at first, but hunger is a powerful motivator. Thomas started with the smallest one, the pure white foal who seemed the most timid. He knelt down, making himself less threatening, and offered the bottle. The foal sniffed it cautiously, then its instincts took over. Within moments it was nursing eagerly from the bottle, its small tail swishing with satisfaction. Encouraged by this success, the other foals lined up, and soon Thomas was moving from one to another, helping them latch onto the bottles and making sure each got their fair share. Duchess watched the entire process with interest, occasionally lowering her head to sniff at the bottles or nuzzle a foal that had finished eating. While the foals ate, Thomas noticed something he had missed in the chaos of the night before. Several of the foals wore small leather halters, and on closer inspection, he could see that each halter had a small metal tag attached. His heart racing with the possibility of answers, he waited until the feeding was finished and then carefully examined the tags. They were engraved with numbers, registration numbers he realized, and a logo he didn't recognize at first. Then it clicked. The logo belonged to Whitestone Ranch, a massive operation about 30 miles north of his property. Whitestone was one of the premier breeding facilities in the state, specializing in rare and valuable horse breeds. If these foals came from Whitestone, they were worth a small fortune. But why would Whitestone's foals end up wandering through a blizzard? The ranch was known for its security and meticulous care of its animals. Nothing about this made sense. Thomas pulled out his phone and searched for Whitestone Ranch's contact information. He was about to call when he heard the sound of tires crunching on snow outside. Looking through the barn's small window, he saw Sheriff Morrison's truck pulling up, followed by a vehicle he didn't recognize, an expensive-looking black SUV with tinted windows. Thomas felt a knot form in his stomach. This was about to get complicated. The sheriff entered the barn first, his weathered face grave. Behind him came a man Thomas had never seen before, tall and lean with silver hair and an air of authority that preceded him like a physical presence. He wore an expensive wool coat and leather gloves that looked like they cost more than Thomas's entire winter wardrobe. The man's eyes immediately went to the foals and something flickered across his face, relief mixed with something else Thomas couldn't quite identify. Anger, perhaps, or fear. "Thomas," the sheriff began, his voice formal in a way that put Thomas on guard. "This is Richard Whitestone. He owns Whitestone Ranch. These are his foals." Richard Whitestone stepped forward, his gaze sweeping over the 8 young horses who had gathered protectively around Duchess. For a long moment, he said nothing, just stared at them with an expression that was difficult to read. Then he spoke, and his voice was tight with controlled emotion. "These foals were stolen from my ranch 2 nights ago. Someone cut through our fencing and took them from their mothers. We've been searching ever since, assuming the worst in this weather. The fact that they're alive is nothing short of miraculous." His eyes moved from the foals to Duchess, and something in his expression softened slightly. "Your mare, she saved them." Thomas felt his protective instincts flare. Stolen? Who would steal foals in the middle of winter? And why leave them to wander in a blizzard? Whitestone's jaw tightened. "We don't know yet. But these aren't just any foals, Mr. McCarthy. They're part of a very rare breeding program. These 8 represent the last of a bloodline we've been trying to preserve for 20 years. They're cream draft horses, a color variation that's nearly extinct. Each one is irreplaceable." The sheriff cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable. "There's more, Thomas. We found tracks near your property line this morning. Someone drove a truck out there and released these foals deliberately. They weren't trying to steal them for profit. They were trying to kill them, let them freeze to death in the storm. Why Duchess's lead mare saved them, that's the only reason they survived." The words hung in the air like poison. Thomas felt rage building in his chest, hot and fierce. Someone had deliberately tried to kill these innocent animals, had stolen them from their mothers, and left them to die in one of the worst blizzards Montana had seen in years. The cruelty of it was beyond comprehension. He looked down at the foals, now huddled around Duchess with their bellies full of formula, content and safe, completely unaware of how close they had come to death. "Who would do such a thing?" Thomas asked, his voice rough with emotion. Richard Whitestone's expression darkened. That's what we're trying to determine. But I have my suspicions." He paused, seeming to weigh how much to reveal. "My brother, James, he's been trying to buy me out of the ranch for years. He wants to shut down the breeding program and turn the property into a resort. These foals represent millions of dollars in future breeding potential. But more than that, they represent a commitment to preservation that my brother sees as a waste of resources." The sheriff interjected, "We're investigating, but we need proof before we can make any accusations. Right now, all we have are suspicions and a lot of questions." Thomas watched as Whitestone approached Duchess and the foals slowly, his expensive shoes sinking into the hay-strewn floor. The businessman knelt down, and one of the foals, the brave little one Thomas had nicknamed Patch, walked over to investigate him. Whitestone extended his hand, and the foal sniffed it cautiously before allowing itself to be petted. For the first time since entering the barn, Whitestone's rigid composure cracked slightly. "I thought I'd lost them," he said quietly. "When we discovered they were missing, when we saw the storm coming in, I thought that was it. 20 years of work, 20 years of trying to save this bloodline gone in one night." Thomas found himself reassessing the man. He had expected a cold businessman, someone who saw the foals purely as investments. But the pain in Whitestone's voice was genuine, the connection real. These weren't just valuable assets to him. They were a mission, a purpose. Thomas understood that kind of dedication. He felt it every time he looked at Duchess, every time he worked the land that had been in his family for 3 generations. Some things matter more than money, and both men recognized that in each other, in that moment. "Your mare," Whitestone said, standing up and turning to face Thomas directly. "She's remarkable. The way she's protecting them, the way they've bonded with her. I've been in the horse business my entire life, and I've never seen anything quite like it. What breed is she?" "Duchess is a Shire," Thomas replied with quiet pride. "I raised her from a foal. Her mother was a rescue, pregnant when we found her, abandoned like these little ones were, though not in such dire circumstances." Thomas ran his hand along Duchess's massive neck. "She's always had a gentle soul despite her size. But I've never seen her take to other horses like this. It's like she knew they needed her." Whitestone nodded slowly, a thoughtful expression on his face. "Draft horses have strong maternal instincts, but this goes beyond that. These foals accepted her immediately, trusted her without question. In the wild, orphaned foals will sometimes bond with an unrelated mare, but it's rare, and it usually takes time. This happened instantly." He looked at the sheriff. "If whoever did this had known about your neighbor having a horse like this, if they had known the foals might find shelter here, they would have chosen a different location. This was luck, fate, call it what you will, The sheriff pulled out a notebook and began asking Thomas questions about the previous night, exactly when he had heard the foals, what condition they were in, whether he had seen or heard any vehicles. Thomas answered as thoroughly as he could, reliving those terrifying moments when he had opened the barn door to find 8 freezing foals stumbling through the snow toward sanctuary. As he talked, he kept one eye on Duchess and her adopted charges. The foals had grown comfortable enough to begin playing, engaging in the kind of gentle roughhousing that young horses do, nipping at each other's manes and attempting small bucks and kicks. Duchess watched them with the patient tolerance of an experienced guardian, only intervening when their play became too rowdy or when one strayed too far from the group. Whitestone watched them too, and Thomas could see the calculations happening behind the man's eyes. Finally, Whitestone spoke. "Mr. McCarthy, I want to make you an offer. I need to get these foals back to the ranch, back to their mothers, but I'm concerned about the stress of moving them so soon after their ordeal. They've bonded with your mare, and separating them might cause psychological trauma. Would you consider bringing Duchess to Whitestone Ranch for a few weeks? Just until the foals are fully recovered and reintegrated with their mothers, I'll pay for her transportation, her boarding, and compensate you for your time. It would give the foals the stability they need during this transition. Thomas felt his chest tighten at the suggestion. Leave his farm. Take Duchess away from the only home she had ever known. The idea unsettled him deeply. This land, this barn, these were the constants in his life, especially since Martha had passed. The routine of his days, the familiar rhythms of farm work, they were what kept him grounded. But as he looked at the foals, at how peacefully they rested against Duchess's enormous legs, at how the giant mare had taken them under her protection without hesitation, he knew what his answer had to be. These little ones had already been through so much trauma. If Duchess could ease their transition back to their real mothers, if her presence could help them heal both physically and emotionally, how could he refuse? "I'll do it," Thomas said finally, his voice steady despite his inner turmoil. "But I'm not taking any payment beyond what's needed to cover expenses." Duchess did what any decent creature would do. She helped those in need. "I'm not going to profit from that." Whitestone looked like he wanted to argue, but something in Thomas's expression must have told him it would be pointless. The old farmer had made up his mind, and no amount of money would change it. "Very well," Whitestone said with a slight nod of respect. "I'll have a transport trailer here by this afternoon. We'll make the move as comfortable as possible for all of them. In the meantime, I need to get back to the ranch and prepare accommodations. Sheriff Morrison will stay to take your full statement and process the scene where the foals were released." After Whitestone left, the sheriff spent another hour with Thomas, photographing the foals, documenting their condition, and taking detailed notes about everything that had happened. When he finally closed his notebook, Morrison looked at Thomas with an expression of concern mixed with admiration. "You know this might not be over, Thomas. If James Whitestone is really behind this, and we can prove it, there's going to be a trial. You'll likely be called as a witness, and if we can't prove it, if he gets away with it, he might try again. These foals are still in danger, and by extension, so is anyone protecting them." Thomas met the sheriff's gaze unflinchingly. "Then I guess it's good that Duchess and I will be at the ranch for a while. Extra eyes, extra protection. I may be old, Morrison, but I can still handle myself if need be." The sheriff smiled slightly. "I don't doubt that. Just be careful. Men who are willing to kill innocent animals to get what they want aren't going to hesitate to threaten people who stand in their way." After Morrison left, Thomas spent the rest of the morning caring for the foals and preparing Duchess for the journey ahead. He groomed her thoroughly, brushing her thick cream-colored coat until it gleamed, working carefully around the foals who insisted on staying close to her even as he worked. He cleaned her hooves, checked her over for any signs of strain from the long night of standing guard, and was pleased to find her in excellent condition. Duchess was strong, built for endurance, and a single night of vigilance hadn't diminished her vitality. The foals, too, seemed to have recovered remarkably well. Their coats had dried completely, fluffing out into soft, fuzzy textures that made them look even younger than they were. They had energy now, bouncing around the barn with increasing confidence. Though they never strayed far from Duchess, Thomas noticed that they had established a hierarchy among themselves. Patch, the one with the darker marking, seemed to be the leader, always the first to investigate something new, and the bravest when approaching Thomas. The smallest pure white foal, whom Thomas had started calling Snow, was the most timid, preferring to stay tucked against Duchess's front legs where it felt safest. The other 6 fell somewhere in between, each with their own emerging personality. As promised, a large horse trailer arrived early in the afternoon. It was a state-of-the-art transport, climate-controlled with padded walls and rubber matting on the floor. 2 experienced handlers emerged, both women who introduced themselves as Sarah and Jennifer, part of Whitestone's permanent staff. They assessed the situation with professional efficiency, immediately recognizing the unique bond between Duchess and the foals. "We've prepared the trailer to accommodate all of them together," Sarah explained to Thomas. Mr. Whitestone was very specific about not separating them during transport. "There's plenty of space, and we'll drive slowly and carefully." The trip should take about 45 minutes under normal conditions, maybe an hour with the road conditions after the storm. Loading the animals proved easier than Thomas had anticipated. Duchess walked calmly into the trailer, and the foals followed her without hesitation. Their trust in the big mare, Absolute Thomas, climbed into his own truck, planning to follow the trailer to Whitestone Ranch. As he pulled out behind them, he cast one last look at his farm, at the barn that had stood through countless storms, at the fields that lay quiet under their blanket of snow. He felt a pang of apprehension, a sense that he was stepping into something much larger and more complex than a simple rescue of lost foals, but there was no turning back now. The drive to Whitestone Ranch took Thomas through landscape he rarely traveled. The roads had been plowed, but snow still piled high on either side, creating white walls that narrowed the path. As they traveled north, the terrain became more dramatic, with rolling hills giving way to steeper inclines and dense stands of pine trees heavy with snow. Thomas kept his eyes on the trailer ahead, watching it navigate the curves with careful precision. True to their word, the handlers drove slowly, taking no chances with their precious cargo. About 30 minutes into the journey, Thomas saw the first signs that they were approaching something significant. A high fence began running alongside the road, professional grade with security features that spoke of serious investment. Then came a gate, massive wrought iron with an elaborate W worked into the design. A guard station stood beside it, occupied by a uniformed security officer who waved the trailer through. After a brief radio exchange, Thomas followed, feeling increasingly out of place in his old pickup truck. The paved drive stretched ahead for what must have been a quarter-mile, lined with perfectly maintained fencing and fields that even under snow looked impeccably groomed. Then the ranch itself came into view, and Thomas had to suppress a whistle of amazement. This wasn't a farm, it was an estate. The main barn was larger than Thomas's entire house, a beautiful structure that somehow managed to look both rustic and elegant. Its wood was perfectly maintained, its roof a combination of traditional shingles and modern solar panels. Beyond it stretched multiple paddocks, several smaller outbuildings, and what appeared to be an indoor riding arena. In the distance, Thomas could see a large house, more mansion than ranch home, perched on a hill overlooking the property. The trailer pulled up to the main barn, and Richard Whitestone emerged to greet them, now dressed more appropriately for ranch work in jeans and a heavy jacket, though even these looked expensive. Behind him stood a group of people, ranch hands and specialists, Thomas assumed, all waiting to help with the foals. But what caught Thomas's attention were the 8 mares standing in a nearby paddock, their heads raised alertly, their bodies tense with anticipation. These were the mothers, cream draft horses like their foals, magnificent animals with the same pale coloring and powerful builds. They had clearly scented or heard their babies because several were calling out, their whinnies sharp with concern and longing. The trailer doors opened, and the handlers began the delicate process of unloading. Duchess came out first, her massive hooves clopping on the ramp, her head high as she surveyed this new environment. The foals followed in a tight cluster, unwilling to leave her side even for a moment. As soon as the mares in the paddock saw the foals, their calls intensified, and the foals responded, their own small voices joining the chorus. It was a sound that went straight to Thomas's heart. A reunion 2 days in the making, but surely feeling like an eternity to the mothers who had lost their babies. Whitestone directed the handlers to open the paddock gate, and what happened next was something Thomas would remember for the rest of his life. The mares surged forward the moment the gate opened, but not in a chaotic rush. Despite their obvious desperation to reach their foals, they moved with surprising order, as if even in their distress they maintained some equine sense of propriety. Each mare seemed to know which foal was hers, heading directly for their offspring with unerring accuracy. The foals, for their part, were torn between their bond with Duchess and their need for their mothers. They danced uncertainly, looking back at the big Shire mare as if asking permission, seeking reassurance. Duchess, in a gesture that seemed almost humanly understanding, lowered her head and gently nudged each foal toward their waiting mother. It was her blessing, her way of telling them it was okay to go, that they were safe now. The reunions were tender and immediate. Each mare inspected her foal thoroughly, nuzzling them, smelling them, checking every inch to ensure they were truly unharmed. The foals nursed eagerly, their small tails swishing with contentment as they finally received the milk their bodies craved. Thomas found himself blinking back tears as he watched. This was what it had all been for, this moment of restoration, of families made whole again. Yet even as the foals nursed and their mothers fussed over them, Thomas noticed they kept looking back at Duchess. The bond formed in those desperate hours hadn't been forgotten. The big mare had saved their lives, and some part of them would always remember that Whitestone approached Thomas, his own eyes suspiciously bright. "I can't thank you enough," he said quietly. "What you and your mare did, what you're doing by being here. It means everything." Thomas spent the first evening at Whitestone Ranch trying to get his bearings in a world that felt entirely foreign to him. The accommodations provided were far more luxurious than anything he was accustomed to. A small guest cottage near the main barn had been prepared for him, complete with a bedroom, bathroom, and kitchenette that would have made Martha green with envy. The furniture was comfortable, the heating worked perfectly, and there was even a television, something Thomas rarely bothered with at home. But despite the comfort, he felt out of place, like a rough stone dropped into a box of polished gems. He found himself drawn back to the barn repeatedly that evening, checking on Duchess, making sure she was adjusting to her new surroundings. Duchess had been given a spacious stall in the main barn, luxuriously appointed with thick bedding, automatic waterers, and a feeding system that seemed almost too sophisticated. The other horses in the barn were magnificent specimens, each one clearly worth a fortune. Thomas recognized several rare breeds he had only read about in magazines, but Duchess, with her enormous frame and gentle presence, held her own among them. She had settled in with her characteristic calm, seeming to understand that this was temporary, that her job here was important. When Thomas visited her that first evening, she greeted him with a soft nicker and pressed her massive head against his chest, seeking the reassurance of their familiar connection. The foals were housed with their mothers in a separate facility designed specifically for mares and young stock. Thomas walked over to check on them, finding all 8 nursing contentedly, their earlier trauma seeming to fade with each passing hour in their mother's care. Yet when they saw him approaching, several lifted their heads and nickered in recognition. Patch, ever the bold one, even took a few steps toward him before its mother called it back. These foals would never forget what Duchess and Thomas had done for them, and the knowledge warmed something deep in the old farmer's chest. He had made a difference, had saved 8 irreplaceable lives, and that meant something in a world that often felt increasingly cold and indifferent. Richard Whitestone found Thomas there, watching the foals through the paddock fence. The ranch owner leaned against the rail beside him, and for a few moments neither man spoke. Finally, Whitestone broke the silence. Sheriff Morrison called. "They've been analyzing the tire tracks and footprints at the release site. They match vehicles and boots belonging to my brother's security team. It's not concrete proof that James ordered it, but it's enough to bring them in for questioning." Thomas absorbed this information slowly. "So it was your brother. He really tried to kill them." Whitestone's jaw tightened. "We've been at odds for years, but I never thought he would go this far. These foals represent the culmination of 2 decades of work. I started the cream draft preservation program when I inherited the ranch. My father thought draft horses were obsolete, relics of a bygone era, But I saw their value beyond economics. These are living pieces of history, genetic treasures that deserve to exist for their own sake. He gestured toward the foals. James thinks I'm wasting money and resources on sentiment. He wants to turn this ranch into a luxury resort, wine tastings and spa treatments for wealthy tourists. It would be profitable, I won't deny that. But it would also mean the end of everything I've built here, every horse I've saved, every bloodline I've preserved. When negotiations failed, when I refused his offers to buy me out, I guess he decided to destroy what I love most. If the breeding program fails, if I lose my foundation stock, the whole operation becomes unsustainable. The ranch would have to be sold and James would swoop in as the buyer. Thomas felt anger burning in his gut. That's evil, pure, calculated evil. To steal babies from their mothers, to leave them to freeze to death just to make a business deal work. Whitestone nodded grimly. The worst part is, if your mare hadn't saved them, he would have gotten away with it. We would have assumed they died from the cold after escaping somehow. There would have been no evidence of foul play. The two men stood in silence again, watching the foals play in the fading light. Then Whitestone spoke again, his voice thoughtful. You know, when I made you the offer to bring Duchess here, I thought it was just about easing the foals' transition, but I'm realizing now that you being here serves another purpose. James doesn't know about you, doesn't know that there's a witness who can testify to finding the foals in the condition they were in. Your presence, your testimony, it makes his plan unravel completely. You and Duchess, you're not just caregivers now, you're evidence, and that makes you both potential targets. Thomas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold evening air. Are you saying we're in danger here? Whitestone met his eyes directly. I'm saying that my brother is desperate and cornered. Desperate men do desperate things. But I've increased security significantly. There are cameras everywhere now, guards patrolling at night, and Sheriff Morrison has deputies checking the property regularly. You're as safe here as you could be anywhere, probably safer than at your own farm, where you'd be isolated and vulnerable. The practical part of Thomas's brain told him he should be afraid, should maybe even pack up Duchess and head home despite the risk. But another part, the part that had kept him on his family's land through hard times and heartbreak, the part that had driven him out into a blizzard to rescue freezing foals. That part refused to be intimidated. I'm not running, Thomas said firmly. Duchess and I, we see things through. We'll stay as long as we're needed. The days that followed settled into a comfortable routine that surprised Thomas with how quickly he adapted. Each morning he would wake before dawn, a habit too ingrained to break even in these luxurious surroundings, and make his way to the barn. Duchess was always awake and waiting, as if she too kept to their old schedule despite the change in location. He would groom her, talk to her about nothing and everything, and then they would take walks around the ranch property. The foals, now thriving under their mother's care, would often come to the fence when they saw Duchess passing, calling out to her with affectionate recognition. The big mare would pause, allowing them to reach through the rails and touch noses with her, acknowledging the bond that would always exist between them. Thomas also found himself drawn into the daily operations of the ranch. Richard Whitestone, despite his wealth and the army of employees at his disposal, was a hands-on owner who spent most of his time in the barns and paddocks. He and Thomas fell into an easy camaraderie, two men who understood that caring for animals was not just a job but a calling. Whitestone taught Thomas about the intricacies of preservation breeding, the careful genetic planning that went into each mating, the records that tracked bloodlines back generations. Thomas, in turn, shared the practical wisdom he had accumulated over decades of farm life, simple solutions to common problems that no amount of money or fancy equipment could replace. They were different men from different worlds, but they spoke the same language when it came to horses. On the 5th day of Thomas's stay, everything changed. It started with a commotion in the middle of the night. shouts, and the sound of vehicles moving quickly across the property. Thomas jerked awake, his heart pounding, and rushed to his window. Security lights blazed across the ranch, and he could see figures running toward the main barn. His first thought was of Duchess, and he was out the door in seconds, not even bothering to fully dress, running through the cold in his thermal underwear and boots he hadn't taken time to lace. When he burst into the barn, he found chaos. Several of Whitestone's security team were restraining two men, while Whitestone himself stood near Duchess's stall, his face pale with rage and something that looked like fear. Thomas rushed to Duchess's stall and found her alert, but unharmed, her ears pinned back in agitation. "What happened?" Thomas demanded, his voice sharp with the adrenaline coursing through him. Whitestone turned to him, and in the harsh barn lights, Thomas could see the man was shaking. "These two were caught trying to inject something into your mare," he said, his voice tight. "One of our night patrols spotted them and intervened before they could complete the injection, but it was close, Thomas. Too close." The old farmer felt ice flood his veins. They were trying to hurt Duchess. One of the security guards held up a syringe, its contents still visible. "We're having it tested, but based on the amount, if they had succeeded in administering this, your horse would likely have died within hours. It would have looked like a sudden illness, probably colic or a heart attack. Nothing that would immediately suggest foul play." Thomas's hands clenched into fists, rage unlike anything he had felt in years threatening to overwhelm his usual calm demeanor. "Who are they? Do they work for your brother?" Whitestone's expression was grim. "They're private contractors, hired muscle. They're not talking, but they don't have to. The evidence speaks for itself. James knew that if Duchess died, you would take the Foals back to your farm or abandon your testimony. He's trying to break the connection, to remove the witness and the symbol of what happened. The sheriff has been called, and these two will be arrested. But Thomas, this means the threat is more serious than we thought. My brother isn't just trying to sabotage the breeding program anymore. He's willing to commit murder, even if it's just an animal, to get what he wants." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. If James Whitestone was willing to kill Duchess, what would stop him from targeting people? Thomas looked at his beloved mare, at her intelligent eyes and gentle face, and felt a fierce protective surge. They had been through so much together, survived Martha's death, the lonely years, the harsh Montana winters. He would not let some greedy businessman destroy her to serve his own ends. Sheriff Morrison arrived within 30 minutes, accompanied by additional deputies and what appeared to be state investigators. The scene in the barn became a hive of official activity, photographs being taken, statements recorded, evidence bagged and labeled. The two men who had attempted to inject Duchess were led away in handcuffs, and Morrison assured Thomas that they would be charged with multiple crimes. More importantly, he explained, their arrest and the evidence against them would be enough to bring James Whitestone in for questioning under much more serious circumstances. As dawn broke over the ranch, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of pink and gold, Thomas sat on a hay bale outside Duchess's stall, emotionally exhausted. Whitestone sat beside him, equally drained. "I'm sorry," Whitestone said quietly. "I brought you here thinking I could protect you and your mare, and instead I nearly got her killed." Thomas was silent for a long moment, then shook his head. "You saved her. Your security stopped them. If Duchess and I had been at my farm, alone and unprotected, they could have done this without anyone knowing until it was too late. Being here, having your guards, that's what saved her life." The arrest of James Whitestone came 3 days later, and it was the culmination of evidence that had been building steadily since the foals were first discovered missing. The two men caught attempting to poison Duchess had decided that cooperation was preferable to lengthy prison sentences, and their testimony implicated James directly in not only the poisoning attempt, but also in the original theft and abandonment of the foals. Additional evidence emerged when investigators discovered financial records showing payments to the men who had cut the fencing and transported the foals to their intended death. James Whitestone was charged with animal cruelty, attempted destruction of property, conspiracy, and several other crimes that would likely see him imprisoned for years. The case became a minor media sensation, with reporters fascinated by the story of 8 foals saved by a gentle giant of a mare and an old farmer who had refused to ignore their cries for help. Throughout the legal proceedings that followed, Thomas found himself thrust into an unfamiliar spotlight. He gave depositions, spoke with prosecutors, and eventually testified in court about that desperate night when he had opened his barn door to find 8 freezing foals stumbling through the snow toward sanctuary. He described Duchess's immediate adoption of them, how she had protected them through the night, how her warmth and presence had kept them alive when death seemed certain. The courtroom was silent as he spoke, and more than one person wiped away tears when he described the reunion between the foals and their mothers. James Whitestone's defense attorneys tried to paint the foals' survival as mere chance, a fortunate accident. But the prosecution's animal behavior experts testified that what Duchess had done was extraordinary, that her actions had demonstrated an unusual level of intelligence and empathy that had directly saved 8 lives. The trial lasted 2 weeks, and at its conclusion, James Whitestone was found guilty on all counts. As he was led from the courtroom, he looked across at his brother Richard with an expression of such hatred that Thomas felt a chill. Some wounds, he realized, ran too deep to ever heal, but justice had been served, and the 8 foals who had nearly died in a blizzard would grow up safe and protected, their bloodline preserved for future generations. For Thomas, the end of the trial meant he could finally return home. He had been at Whitestone Ranch for 6 weeks, far longer than the originally anticipated few weeks, but the time had been necessary. The foals had needed to fully recover and reintegrate with their mothers, and Thomas's presence had been required for the legal proceedings. Now, with winter finally beginning to loosen its grip on Montana, and early spring showing in the first signs of melting snow, it was time to go back to his own land. The morning of his departure, Thomas made one final visit to the foals. They were thriving now, their coats glossy and their bodies filling out with proper nutrition and maternal care. At nearly 3 months old, they were starting to show the characteristics that would make them magnificent adult horses someday. When Thomas approached their paddock, all 8 lifted their heads and trotted over to greet him. He had brought apples, which he distributed carefully, one for each foal, marveling at how much they had grown since that desperate night. Patch, still the boldest, pushed forward to nuzzle Thomas's pocket, looking for more treats. Snow, the smallest, stayed at the back of the group but watched with those intelligent dark eyes that seemed to hold memory and gratitude. Richard Whitestone appeared beside Thomas, and together they watched the foals return to their play. These 8 will form the foundation of the next generation, Whitestone said quietly. In a few years, when they're mature enough to breed, they'll help ensure that the cream draft bloodline continues. Because of what you did, because Duchess opened her heart to them, this entire program has a future. Your mare didn't just save 8 foals, Thomas. She saved an entire piece of living history. Thomas felt the weight of those words, the significance of what had happened during one stormy night. He had thought he was simply rescuing abandoned animals, doing what any decent person would do. But it had become something more, something larger than himself. It had become about preservation, about standing against cruelty and greed, about proving that kindness and courage could triumph even in the darkest circumstances. When it came time to load Duchess into the trailer for the journey home, something unexpected happened. The 8 foals, along with their mothers, gathered at their paddock fence, and together they called out to her. It was a chorus of farewell, a recognition of the bond that had formed between the giant Shire mare and the tiny foals she had protected. Duchess answered them, her deep whinny carrying across the ranch, and for a moment, the conversation between horses seemed to hold more meaning than any human words could convey. Thomas stood watching, his hand on Duchess's massive shoulder, and understood that this was why the foals had really come to his barn that night. Not just because it was shelter from the storm, though it had been that. Not just because fate had guided them there, though perhaps it had. They had come because somewhere in the vast mystery of animal instinct and connection, they had known that Duchess would save them. They had known that she was exactly who they needed her to be. A mother when they had been torn from their mothers. A guardian when they faced death. A bridge between trauma and safety. The drive home was quiet. Thomas following the trailer as it carried Duchess back to familiar territory. When they finally arrived at his farm, the old barn standing weathered but strong against the clearing sky, Thomas felt something settle in his chest. This was where he belonged, where Duchess belonged. But they were different now, changed by what they had experienced and what they had done. As he led Duchess into her stall, as she settled back into her home with a contented sigh, Thomas knew that the story of 8 foals and a gentle giant would be told and retold. A reminder that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness can preserve something precious and irreplaceable. And in the years to come, when Duchess was long gone and the foals had grown into their own magnificent selves and produced foals of their own, people would still remember that freezing winter night when courage and compassion had saved not just 8 lives, but an entire legacy.